Here's something worth considering. The most powerful nation in the Western Hemisphere, fresh from fighting the bloodiest war in its history, a war fought, at least in part, over whether human beings could be owned, decided to celebrate the end of that war by sending its president to the theater with almost no protection. One man, one guard, and that guard, as history will note with its characteristic cruelty, decided to step out for a drink. This is not a story about a bullet. It is a story about a civilization that had just survived its worst catastrophe and, in the very moment of relief, stopped paying attention. They always stop paying attention at exactly the wrong moment. It is April 1865. The Confederate Army has collapsed. Robert E. Lee has surrendered. 4 years of a war that killed approximately 620,000 Americans, more than every other American war combined, has ground to something resembling an end. Washington, D.C. is celebrating. Flags are hanging. Bands are playing. People are drunk on relief. Abraham Lincoln is 56 years old and looks 70. Photographs from this period are almost difficult to look at, and not because of anything dramatic, but because of how profoundly exhausted a human face can appear when it has been carrying something enormous for years. He has been threatened, mocked, despised, and called a tyrant by roughly half the country. He has received hundreds of death threats. He has reportedly dreamed of his own death. He's going to the theater anyway, partly because Mary wants to go, and partly because canceling would disappoint the public. History is full of decisions that seem reasonable at the time. The war may be ending, but the country is not healed. It is simply too tired to keep fighting openly. Lincoln is preparing a Reconstruction plan that his own party finds too forgiving. The South finds it humiliating. The North finds it naive. He has, with extraordinary skill, managed to make nearly everyone unhappy, which is perhaps the most honest definition of political leadership ever demonstrated. And somewhere across town, a man with excellent cheekbones and a deeply unfortunate sense of destiny is making his own plans. John Wilkes Booth was, by every contemporary account, extraordinarily handsome. This is not an irrelevant detail. He was a celebrity, a famous actor from a famous acting family, performing in a country where theater was the dominant entertainment, before film, before radio, before anything that could distract a person from their thoughts for longer than 20 minutes. He was also, by most measures, wildly successful. He earned the equivalent of today's comfortable upper-class income. Women adored him. Audiences adored him. He had everything. He was also absolutely convinced that everything was about to be destroyed. Booth was a Marylander who never served in the Confederacy, and as a fact that appeared to generate in him a specific kind of guilt that fermented over years into something almost theatrical in its intensity. He was not a soldier. He was a man who watched a war he believed in from a safe distance and felt, perhaps, that the least he could do was perform something spectacular. This is the psychology of men who mistake drama for action. He believed in the Confederacy with the fervor of someone who had nothing practical at stake and everything symbolic to lose. He believed in white supremacy with the confidence of a man who had never been required to examine it. He believed Abraham Lincoln was a tyrant, a dictator, dismantling the republic, enslaving the South, destroying civilization as God had apparently intended it to be organized. None of this was connected to reality, but conviction rarely requires that relationship. By early 1865, as Confederate armies crumbled, something shifted in Booth. The cause was losing, not losing quietly, losing completely, visibly, historically. And a man who had spent years performing on stages, who understood narrative and climax and the power of a single unforgettable moment, began to construct one. He had initially planned to kidnap him, capture Lincoln, use him as a bargaining chip to revive the Confederacy's negotiating position. He assembled a small, chaotic group of co-conspirators, people who ranged from genuinely dangerous to almost comically inept. The kidnapping plots failed, repeatedly. The conspirators missed their moments. Lincoln moved unexpectedly. Plans collapsed. If you enjoy watching history balance on absurdly small hinges, you may want to subscribe, because it is about to balance on the smallest one yet. By April 1865, the war's end had transformed the plan. There was nothing left to negotiate. Booth shifted from kidnapping to something that in his mind had the weight of Roman history. He would kill the president. He would kill the vice president. He would kill the Secretary of State. He would decapitate the Union government in a single night, and And here's where the thinking becomes genuinely unmoored from cause and effect. Somehow inspire the South to rise again. He was an actor who had confused himself with the character. On the morning of April 14th, 1865, Booth stopped at Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. This was routine. He kept a box there. The theater was his second home. While collecting it, he learned that President Lincoln and General Ulysses Grant would be attending that evening's performance of Our American Cousin. The announcement had been made publicly. Because this is 1865, and the idea that publicizing the president's exact location and schedule could be dangerous had not yet impressed itself upon the relevant authorities. Booth walked the theater. He knew it perfectly. Every entrance, every exit, every sightline. He knew the presidential box above the stage. He knew that during the third act, a particular line would make the audience laugh loudly enough to cover almost any sound. He had performed in this building. He understood its acoustics. He spent the rest of the day making arrangements with the calm efficiency of a man who has finally found clarity. He assigned targets to his co-conspirators. He wrote a letter justifying his actions, to be published naturally, because even in this, he could not entirely abandon the performer's instinct for an audience. He drank. He visited a woman he was fond of. He did the things a person does when they believe today is their last ordinary afternoon. By evening, he was ready. His cause was gone. His country, the imagined one, the one he had constructed in his mind with moonlight and mythology, had been defeated. There was nothing left to do but make a gesture large enough that history would be forced to notice. This is what happens when a man mistakes significance for meaning. Ford's Theater, 10:13 p.m. Lincoln is in the presidential box with Mary, a young couple named the Rathbones, and his sole protection, a Washington Metropolitan Police officer named John Frederick Parker, who had left his post. Where Parker went remains a matter of some historical debate. What is not debated is that he was not there. The play is in its third act. The audience is laughing. Booth enters the theater from the back, nods to people he knows, because he's famous, and famous people are not stopped, climbs the stairs to the dress circle, moves along the back wall, and enters the vestibule behind the presidential box. He has prepared it in advance, a small wooden bar, a hole drilled in the door so he could observe the position of his target. He waited. He found his moment in the laughter. He opened the door. He raised a single-shot Derringer to the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. He fired. The box erupted. Rathbone lunged at Booth and was slashed across the arm with a knife. Booth leaped from the box to the stage, a drop of about 11 feet, caught his spur on the decorative bunting and landed hard, snapping a bone in his left leg. He rose, turned to the stunned audience, and reportedly shouted, "Sic semper tyrannis, thus always to tyrants," the state motto of Virginia. Then he ran. The audience, for several seconds, was not entirely certain whether this was part of the performance. This says something about theater. It also says something about us. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house. He never regained consciousness. He died at 7:22 the following morning, April 15th, 1865, with his cabinet gathered around him, Mary in a separate room in a state of complete collapse, and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton reportedly saying, "Now he belongs to the ages." Booth was hunted for 12 days. He was found hiding in a Virginia barn which was set on fire. He was shot, possibly by a soldier, possibly by his own hand, depending on the source, and died on the porch of the barn, reportedly asking that his hands be held up so he could look at them and murmuring, "Useless, useless." His co-conspirators were tried by a military tribunal and hanged. The trial was conducted with the thoroughness one applies when already certain of the verdict. Now here's where history does what history does best. It produces exactly the opposite of what was intended. Booth killed Lincoln to save the South from Reconstruction. Lincoln's Reconstruction plan was, by the standards of the radical Republicans who now controlled Congress, far too lenient. Lincoln had spoken of malice toward none. He had wanted to bring the southern states back into the Union quickly, without prolonged punishment. With Lincoln gone, the radical Republicans had no one to restrain them. Reconstruction became punitive. Federal troops occupied the South. The policies Booth feared as tyrannical were replaced by policies considerably more severe than anything Lincoln had proposed. Booth had, with extraordinary precision, achieved the exact opposite of his goal. He had also, in killing Lincoln, removed the one man most likely to have pushed meaningfully for the civil rights of formerly enslaved people during the years immediately following the war, a period that instead descended into a slow catastrophe of broken promises, black codes, and the eventual rise of organized terror movements that would define American racial life for another century. The gesture meant to save a civilization ensured that civilization's worst instincts would continue unimpeded. This is the part where, if you have been finding history instructive, a like on the video would not go unappreciated. It helps. Unlike most of the decisions covered here, we tell the Lincoln assassination as a tragedy, and it is. But there is something worth sitting with in its specific shape. The shape of a man who understood power only as performance, who believed that removing one person from history would redirect the entire current of it. Booth was not stupid. He was educated, articulate, passionate. He had looked at the world and constructed a coherent story about it. The story was wrong, but its wrongness was not obvious to him because the story had the most dangerous quality a story can have. It made him the hero. This is the recurring error, not the violence. The violence is just a tool. The error is the belief that history has a single author. That one dramatic act can rewrite everything. That significance is something you can force. Lincoln himself understood something different. He had prosecuted a war he found devastating, made decisions that haunted him visibly, and emerged with a philosophy of reconciliation that his era found almost incomprehensibly generous. He was not naive about power. He was precise about its costs. The man who believed in gentle reconstruction was replaced by men who believed in punishment. The man who wanted to heal a country was replaced by a country that didn't yet know how to begin. And the man who pulled the trigger died in a burning barn, staring at his hands with nothing accomplished. Power does not fear the dramatic gesture. It barely notices. What power fears, what actually changes history, is patience, endurance, and the willingness to govern something as unglamorous as a nation trying badly to become better. That is far less theatrical. It is also far harder to stop. The most dangerous belief in politics is that history is waiting for a hero. It never was. It was always just waiting for better decisions.